professor of both Harvest Bible College and Urshan College. Let's welcome Brother Leonard.
Well, everybody that's been a part of this symposium, welcome back from lunch. To those of you that are in here for a grade, my apologies. My presentation this afternoon is on blended family ministries, life in a blender. Now, a lot of people own blenders. You may own a blender. My wife had to tell me that this is a Vitamix, not a blender, so be very careful with it. Blended drinks or smoothies are really popular. There are businesses that are all about smoothies, breakfast smoothies, vegetable smoothies, fruit smoothies. There's all kinds of different recipes with various ingredients. My wife even tricked me one time into drinking this smoothie that had beets in it. But what are the ingredients of a blended family? I wish I could do like a Swedish chef and, the versy but I promised Dr. Miller I would not make a mess. But what are the ingredients of a blended family? Well, you take a new marriage, you add kids from previous marriages, and then then you take two sets of rules, two different traditions, two different cultures, and then you put them in the blender. And what do you get? I hope I don't break my wife's Vitamix. Well, see what you get is a lot of turmoil. It's kind of loud in a blender, right? And that's what happens. The blender spins in a vortex. It forms a vacuum where all the ingredients combine together. And as you can see, it's kind of loud in that blender. Well, like the tempest of this blender, life in a blended family often involves a whirlwind of challenges, mixing his, hers, sometimes their kids together, as well as in-laws and ex-laws, or maybe they're outlaws. The power vacuum of a departed spouse, different cultures, different rules of this, that. I didn't know that. Well, now we know. And though some couples seemingly blend well from the start, most blend through trial and error and struggle. And unfortunately, blended families don't always blend as smooth as we would like them. And maybe the texture of a blended family isn't really palatable to our expectations and preconceptions of what family should be. Blended families are unique from once married families in that they blend two pre-existing families into one home, but also extend to one or two other families who retain some sort of influence over the children. Blended marriages are foundationally different from first marriages in that the couples coming together have suffered a loss, a hurt in a previous marriage. Outside forces as well as past emotional baggage pose a threat to blended marriages. Blended families need to rely on God's strength and power and center their relationship on Christ to give hope and strength through those tough times. Because blended families begin with children and have had no time to build a history, the family faces the difficult task of a developed family while possessing the experience of a brand new family. So some of the initial family issues that blended families face include what to call the step-parents. Mom, dad, stepmom, stepdad, call them by their name. Expectations for instant gratification, instant affection, grieving a lost familial relationship. And one of the challenges of ministering and counseling blended families is to identify and appreciate the peculiar qualities that work within each family. So I want to do a quick impromptu survey. This is not scientific by any means, but how many of you, by show of hands, have heard a message in your congregation, if you've preached it or you've heard it in your congregation, not YouTube, but in your congregation on divorce and remarriage? Raise your hand. All right. Now, how many of you know of blended families in your congregation? Do you see the out of balance there? Many apostolics have never heard a lesson on divorce and remarriage let alone a positive message on divorce and remarriage. Yet divorce and remarriage occur in the church, and by extension, blended families make up a part of every one of our congregations. In fact, some of you may be direct or indirect members of a blended family. Many Christian denominations portray blended families as the exception of what not to do, rather than the norm of traditional families. However, blended families represent a growing entity, not only in society, but also in the church. So do the statistics justify the need for blended family ministry or counseling? Consider the following. 46% of marriages today are remarriages. 1 out of 3 Americans is now a step-parent, step-child, step-sibling, or some other member of a blended family. More than half of Americans living today will live in at least one blended family situation in their lifetime. Now, back in 1997, experts predicted that by 2010, there would be more blended families in the U.S. than any other type of families. 50% of American children will see their parents divorce, and 50% of those children will see at least one parent divorce a second time. So we all know that divorce and remarriage happens. It's been happening since before Deuteronomy chapter 24. There were blended families back in the Bible. In fact, some of the most prominent biblical families, by definition, represent blended families. I mean, technically, Jesus was raised by his stepfather. Many Old Testament families with multiple marriages represent the same complex dynamics of modern stepfamilies. As Ron Deal observes, blended families have always been a part of God's people. We all have blended families in our local congregations, yet Ron Deal, who is a minister and a licensed marriage and family counselor, he's the author of the best-selling series, The Smart Step Family, he points out that most church leaders do not perceive the need to minister to blended families. Why? Well, blended families remain invisible to church leaders for 2 main reasons. Number one, there is a lower percentage of blended families in the church. So although blended families make up 25 to 39% of the general population of the U.S., they're only about 6% in our churches. And then the number 2 reason why ministers and pastors don't perceive the need for blended family ministry is because of spiritual marginalization. So you say spiritual marginalization. Brother Whaley, what does that mean? Well, what that means is the church as a whole looks at blended families as being spiritually insignificant. Whether that means the members of a blended family believe that they can no longer be used in God's kingdom, or the church looks at the members of a blended family as no longer being able to be used in the kingdom. As such, blended families are made to feel like unclean outsiders or second-class Christians who do not fit ideologically within the congregation, which results in many blended families remaining closet step families within the church out of fear of judgment for the past or a reminder through their differentness of spiritual marginalization. In fact, many churches don't want to perceive the need to minister to blended families because it challenges commonly held beliefs on marriage and family life. But if we, especially as apostolics, are going to be body ministry, ministering holistically to the whole church body, we must include blended families. Many churches do not want to perceive the need to minister to blended family because, again, it challenges their view of what traditional family and their view of divorce and remarriage means. Some congregations may be doing better than other congregations, but as a whole, there is a void. And not just in the apostolic churches. As Ron Deal points out, it's in the church world, denominations included. But there is a void in how our churches are ministering to blended families. For example, last year, my wife and I were a part of these series, 4-lesson series. She was in the Mentoring Moms. I sat through Courageous Dads. Not in one of those 8 lessons over the course of a month did they ever mention blended families or step-parents. Ron Deal observes that most blended family ministries in the early 20th century are the result of grassroots efforts of blended families themselves. So with the prevalence of blended families within society, pastors should include counseling blended families into their ministries, especially since the parents of blended families often look toward the church for guidance. You see, blended families often encourage or encounter struggles and hardships that traditional, or dare I say, normal families never face. For example, how is a pastor supposed to counsel a blended family in their church who's struggling to raise their children with an uncooperative ex? Or as the book title says, joint custody with a jerk. Author and professor on divorce recovery, Laura Petherbridge, illustrates the need for blended family ministries in that the parenting dynamics between blended and traditional families are radically different. You see, it's called a blended family, but trying to meld 2 families together can oftentimes feel like living in the blender. Making a family work is a challenge in and of itself, but then you add the constant whirlwind of activities and visitation and competing needs and uncooperative exes, and then you have all of a sudden the making of a bad reality TV show. But blended families need that reassurance from the church that they are loved and are accepted and that they still have a purpose. So how do pastors begin ministering and counseling blended families? For one, they need to communicate a message of hope. They need to reassure blended families that they still have a purpose in God's kingdom. Even as an organization, the UPCI licenses remarried ministers, that is, parents of blended families, so long as they submit the proper documentation regarding the cause of their divorce. So if the UPCI as an organization licenses and ordains people who are part of blended families into the ministry, then local congregations should not have reservations about accepting blended families into their local ministries. Next, the pastor needs to educate leadership and church staff to consider blended family ministry as an evangelistic outreach. A blended family may indeed feel the Holy Spirit drawing them to our local congregations, but still have reservations about whether or not they're going to be accepted. They also need to educate their staff and ministry teams on how to interact with blended families. Now, many of our churches have welcome centers, connect centers, things of that nature. Now, on the plus side, we're real good about welcoming guests as they come in, but imagine a first-time visiting blended families anxiety when a well-meaning church greeter starts asking the parents, or worse, the children, about last names, and whose last name's not the same. You see, already, before they even step foot in the sanctuary, they're singled out as a blended family. Or you may even have the well-meaning minister or Bible teacher who's teaching on families, and they put a slide up on the screen that says, giving up is not the best option. It's a very poor choice of words to describe divorce, because there are many parents of blended families that never gave up on their first marriage. The other partner did. Jesus said, except you hate your parents, your spouse, your children, you can't follow after me. So some of them people had to make a hard choice to hate that first relationship in order to follow Christ, because they had to go make the tough decision because of constant infidelity, because of constant mental or physical abuse, to get out, not give up, but get out of toxic marriages. And that really was the best option for them and their children. So churches can create support groups or Bible classes for blended families. We have hyphen, we have singles classes, we have ladies' Bible classes. Why not blended family classes? Now, this is one of the things that Ron Deal focuses on with his Smart Step Family Ministry. He has a weekly Zoom meeting with blended families. And if we have blended families in our apostolic churches, then who best to network together but the apostolic churches for those apostolic families? Likewise, youth staff need to develop counseling skills to minister to children of blended families to better incorporate them into the youth to help their spiritual growth. And so finally, I want to leave with you some recommended reading for learning more on pastoral counseling blended families. First and foremost is Ron Deal's website, smartstepfamilies.com. Ron has articles there geared directly at ministers and church leaders to help them in counseling blended families. Ron addresses the barriers in ministering to blended families and overcoming the stigma of appearing to be pro-divorce through blended family ministry. In addition, he offers legal and practical advice to ministers counseling children of blended families to safeguard the children, the minister, and the church. In addition, a book that I highly recommend by an apostolic author, by John Carroll, An Introduction to Divorce and Remarriage, A Biblical Theology of Healing After Heartbreak. Now, this is a book written by an apostolic who's walked in a certain pair of shoes. And it's a very detailed look into the biblical teaching on divorce and remarriage. And there's not very many apostolics who have written on the subject of divorce and remarriage. Dr. Miller has a book. It's been out of print. It's now at PPH and on Amazon. I checked this week. Also, I would highly recommend David Enstone Brewer's books on divorce and remarriage. Brother Carroll leaned very heavily on Enstone Brewer in his studies for divorce and remarriage. Another author to look into is Laura Petherbridge. She herself is a stepmother, and she writes books and web articles for Focus on the Family, other marriage family websites from her experiences as a Christian stepmother. And of course, there is my favorite book title in this presentation, Joint Custody with a Jerk. This is more geared toward actual parents of blended families, but pastors can glean things from this book regarding the struggles that blended families face. And finally, there is Smalley and Smalley, The Blended Marriage. The late Dr. Gary Smalley was a family counselor, and his son, Dr. Greg Smalley, likewise followed in his father's footsteps. This book offers a scriptural and personal insight into counseling and members of blended family. It has a simple design. It really works well for the foundation to the start of any kind of counseling blended families in the church. So with so many available tools online and in printed form, there's no excuse for pastors and church leaders to neglect ministering to blended families. The mantra of the United Pentecostal Church for many years has been the whole gospel to the whole world by the whole church. The whole world includes blended families. The whole church includes blended families. So Deal reminds pastors and ministers that ministering to blended families or using blended families in ministry does not mean they're pro-divorce any more than going to doctors means you're pro-illness. Any pastoral study into family counseling or preaching on families should also include blended families. Blended families are no longer, blended family ministries no longer need to be the outcome of grassroots efforts from blended families themselves. Rather, blended families need reassurance from pastors and churches that they have a significance, not only in the local church, but in God's kingdom. And such confirmation can be made through proper training and available tools in counseling blended families. Thank you.